Why he squished in them down questions can tell the cat out kicken lechach tali hastis uskanala
He squeezed Chichawasket, Pamela Barnes. It's my honor to officially welcome you to the unceded territory of the Sioux people. But before I do that, I want to first share with you a little bit about what our lands mean to us. So here in this part of Turtle Island, which is how we refer to North America, contact with others is fairly recent. It's about 200 years, where other parts of the continent, it's 500, 1,000 years, depending on where. With those newcomers came definitions that don't fit with our traditional historical concept of our relationship to the land. One of those concepts is that of land ownership. We don't see ourselves as owners of the land in the same European or Western concept. We see ourselves as borrowing these lands from our great, 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 great grandchildren. And there's a really big difference between those two concepts, one of land ownership and that of borrowing. If I own this necklace, I can do what I want with it. I can sell it, I can trade it, I can give it away, I can take great care of it, or I can toss it on my nightstand. It's mine. I can do what I want with it. But if I borrow this, everything changes. I'm expected, first of all, to care for it to the very best of my ability. And there's an expectation that I leave it or return it in at least the same condition that I found it. And if at all possible, better. I can't sell it. I can't trade it, and I can't give it away. It's not mine to do that with. In our worldview, we recognize that we're here for only a moment in time. And that's part of that understanding of our borrowing all of this from the future generations. So it's with that understanding that our people first welcomed others to the traditional unceded territory of the Sioux people. And it's with that understanding that today I invite you and welcome you to the unceded territory of the Sioux people, with the gentle reminder that none of us, including ourselves, are doing the best job that we can to take care of this for all of our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Linda.
Kokskaag down in a Limnum Kulm Chutten kan wist. Tali hastis uskanala. Smistim tatska ken me grapstim is in kailsted. Why apanas galgalt why isktem. Why chkitski itzalt. Is mekt is het tali hastikeltem hulachtet. Why is naksil why wistis ulusami te jajatstem te spikalt wichem te spitlem uslapna why pechamel ikel stikelt ikel nkwasti is mekt wel tali hast koala why lemnum kulm Chutten kan wist why kuchkitskala tali hasti is usne kul hoy tatska ken ikel chitchit jab hasti hoy thank the Creator for allowing me to say a few words, a little prayer. You know, the things that we do, we do with a kind heart and an open heart. We'll welcome you to our territory, to our land. You know, at this time of year, you know, the rains have come, the snow has come, and that's very good for the land. You know, when we got here, we all got here, and we're enjoying this evening or today, and it's very good for us to be here. So thank you very much. Live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and welcome back for those of you who have attended some talks in the past with us. As you might know, my name is Victoria Burge. I'm the education coordinator of adult programming here at the Kelowna Art Gallery. On behalf of the board of directors and staff, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I will begin this evening's talk by acknowledging that the land on which the gallery stands is the unceded traditional territory of the Okanagan Syilx people. Tonight, we're joined by Georgiana Ulyarek, who is the final speaker in our Northern Pine Lecture Series, which is organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Northern Pine Watercolors and Drawings, by the Group of 7 from the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. And this exhibition will be closing on Sunday, March 7th. So if you live in Kelowna, be sure to try and make your way down here and catch it before it's gone. Just a little bit about Georgiana before we begin. Georgiana Ulyarek is the Frederick S. Eaton Curator of Canadian Art and co-lead of the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. She's currently an adjunct faculty member in art history departments at York University and the University of Toronto, and research associate of modern literature and culture at Ryerson University. She's originally from Romania, but now lives in Toronto with her twin sons. She's joining us from her home today. Lastly, before I turn it over to Georgiana, just a few housekeeping rules. If you could please save all of your questions for the last 15 minutes of the talk. As always, I will try my best to get to everybody's questions. Be sure that you type them into the chat bar, and make sure that your settings are set to message all panelists and not on private. I also would like to mention that today's lecture is being recorded for future purposes. So if you do happen to miss it or know somebody who would love to check it out at a later date, you'll be able to find it up on our website. Okay, so that's it for me. Georgiana, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be in Kelowna, technically, I guess, but I am speaking to you from Toronto. That is now my home and has been the home of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga of the Credit, as well as the Huron-Wendat. This land is governed by a number of treaties that remind us of our responsibilities to take very good care of the beautiful lands around these Great Lakes. And I'm very fortunate to be living and working here. It is here where I actually discovered the work of Kathleen Munn, so I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you about her today. She is an artist who has fascinated me since my graduate work at York University with Professor Joyce Ziemens in the 1990s. So it has been a passion that I've had now, I guess, for about 25 years, over 25 years. And I continue to find her work very surprising and very meaningful. And as I was thinking about the invitation that was so kindly forwarded to me by the Kelowna Art Gallery to speak about a work around the exhibition Northern Pine, I thought about drawing in the very importance of drawing, as Robin Lawrence speaks about in her essay. Through drawing, we can expand our notion of what art might have been like at the early 20th century in Canada, and really expand our notion of these artists who have made these works that have become so familiar, at least in English Canada. They're so very much lodged at this English Canadian identity, at least in Ontario, that it's through the drawings in particular that we can understand a little bit more about their relationships, their lives, but also other things they were interested in. And so with the focus on Mun and her drawing in particular, her drawing practice in particular, I want to expand this discussion even further because drawing has occupied a fundamental space in human expression, from ancient cave and sand and rock drawings around the world to the very first marks that every single one of us has made as young children. Drawing is really essentially about mark making. And I can figure out how to forward my slides. I find this quote from Margaret Priest, an artist currently based in Toronto, originally from the United Kingdom, who is also very nicely represented in the Kelowna Art Gallery collection, where she really speaks about this notion of drawing being the definitive human endeavor, that drawing is an immediate expression, pre-verbal, pre-language. She speaks of this notion of an act of faith, of the immediacy of drawing to connect, to instantly be able to express something. And there's so many examples that I can give, but I also wanted to kind of bring it home a little bit, again, with a really important work from the Kelowna Art Gallery and the work of Anne Kipling, someone who, through her sort of focus on the undergrowth of all the different places in British Columbia in which she has lived, she has expressed them and has had this ongoing practice of drawing in which she expresses her connection to land. And Christiane Flug, an artist who was born in Berlin but moved to Toronto in 1959, she spoke about the way in which, through her drawing, she was able to understand where she was. So whenever she would move to a new place, it was through drawing that she understood where she was. And it may appear in this way that the drawing, like many of the drawings in the exhibition, in the Group 7 exhibition.
Sorry, Georgiana. Sorry, I need to interrupt you. I believe we have some people that their image feed is not working. They're not able to see the screen share. Do you mind if we try stopping the screen share and trying again?
Absolutely.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right.
Okay. Okay, folks, can somebody tell me on the chat if you can see? How about now? Do we see a slideshow with 2 black and white images? Yes? Okay. Oh, good. Yay. Okay, thank you, everybody. All right, we are back in action. So sorry about that, Georgiana. You can take it away again.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad, because it would be crazy that I was speaking I'm speaking into the air as it is, but to not be able to see these beautiful drawings. So I don't know if people missed this beautiful quote by Margaret Priest that I wanted everybody to see in her beautiful drawing, where she spoke about the fundamental, essential drawing. And then these 2 drawings, one by Anne Kipling and the other one by Christiane Flug. And so what I was trying to say with these works is that in some way they may appear to be related to the kind of drawing that might be in the exhibition, where these were artists, like these Group of 7 artists were responding immediately to a place and their connection to it. But what I would like to focus on is actually how drawing is much more than sketching an impression or a notation of a time, of a place, of a view, but rather drawing is a primary portal to articulating a whole new way of seeing, a singular expression of a vision. And Georgia O'Keeffe, I find to be quite an exemplary artist when it comes to this notion, this kind of liberation, freedom, and of expression that comes through drawing. Because it was actually, even though she was highly trained formally in Chicago, New York, and many other places, in 1915, she decided to take a make a critical decision. And as she wrote at the time, she decided to start anew, to strip away what I have been taught, and to work exclusively in charcoal in order to express, as she put it, the things in my head that are not like what anyone has taught me, shapes and ideas so near to me. And from then on, from 1915 on, she continues to draw, make work almost exclusively in charcoal. And while she's claiming that she's undoing her training, what O'Keeffe in effect was doing is to come into her own by internalizing and responding to the art principles of her professor, Arthur Wesley Dow, who wrote, and I quote him, "Artistic skill cannot be given by dictation or acquired by reading. It does not come by merely learning to draw, by imitating nature, or by any process of storing the mind with facts. The power is within. The question is how to reach it and use it." Arguably, harnessing her power within becomes O'Keeffe's project for the rest of her career. And I like to start with O'Keeffe because I think that almost anyone can conjure up a painting by O'Keeffe, so she's very well known. But I like to concentrate on this emphasis on self, that inner feeling, knowledge. This is what O'Keeffe made her lifelong artistic pursuit. "It is the thing I am that makes the work," she wrote in the mid-1930s. So exhilarated she was by these charcoal drawings that she actually sends them, she rolls them up. She was living in Texas at the time. She rolls them up and sends them to her friend in New York, her friend Anita Politzer. And this, again, sort of a very important moment in her career because this actually changes and actually launches her career, because Anita herself, being so taken with these drawings, actually shares them with Alfred Stieglitz without O'Keeffe knowing anything about this. She takes them to his gallery. He has no idea who she is, never heard of her, doesn't know anything about her, sees the drawings and sees the power in them and how unique they are, and invites her to have an exhibition at his space, which was quite a momentous invitation. And it was exclusively based on the strength of these charcoals that she was able to launch her career. I wanted to take this little prelude through O'Keeffe before I got to Kathleen Munn to highlight the power of drawing, this act of faith that Margaret was talking about, but also in order to set up a context, give you a kind of sense of the kind of ideas that artists at the turn of the century, in the first early decades of the 20th century, were really thinking about. Because this search for new artistic expression really dominated the thinking in what we now refer to as Western art. These were artists like the Group of Seven, many associated with them. They were in search of something, an awakening of their consciousness. And while they shared this spirit, the spirit of search, and they in many ways shared inspiration. For example, Kathleen Munn was also very inspired by Arthur Wesley Dow. How each of them came to express it is unique and very much their own. And for me, Munn presents a really intriguing case study in thinking about drawing this way, because while she was very active in artistic circles and she exhibited quite a bit, especially up until the 1940s, her practice remained quite apart. She shaped her own vision, pursued her own interests, and never compromised. She was born in Toronto in 1887, which coincidentally also happens to be the year that Georgia O'Keeffe was born, just on the other side of the border. And from a very early age, she knew that she wanted to be an artist. And I'm showing you a photograph of Mun around 1928 in the Catskills, where she spent the summers painting, and where eventually she wanted to actually build a home and be able to paint there. But that did not come to be. She was born into a very large middle-class family, and her parents very much supported all of the children's pursuits. She was the youngest. She wanted to be an artist, and they supported that from the very beginning. There's not a lot that we really know about her personal life. There's no private letters or journals, and those who knew her best have long since passed away, sadly. She did have a close circle of friends, in particular Bertram Burker in Toronto, but she never married and had no children, and it actually came to her nephews and her nieces to take up her legacy. And indeed, Mun lived quite a very long life, but by the end of her life, she lived with all of her work almost in her own solo retrospective in her home. But around 1909, she began to travel in Europe, and she also went to New York and Philadelphia between 1912 and 1928 to train. And this is where she began to imagine very conventional subjects in a radically new visual vocabulary. I'm showing you a painting that is in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada. And indeed, her first truly modern paintings are quite extraordinarily of cows and chickens and pigs. And her subject matter really was established very early on and didn't change. She painted landscapes, figure studies, biblical themes, and still lives. This is what she painted and did not move from that. And, you know, it's important to remember that such pastoral subject matter was very popular in Europe and North America in the 19th century and well into the 20th century, with very modern artists such as Franz Marc, a member of the Blue Rider group, who was very influential to Mun, who saw his work, knew about him. As she traveled, as I mentioned, to Europe, as she saw exhibitions at the Metropolitan, because we have to remember that around 1912, when she first went to New York, there was no Museum of Modern Art, there was no Guggenheim. It really was just the Metropolitan Museum of Art, exhibitions around town, temporary exhibitions, and of course, going to artist lectures. And she was interested in everything. She was interested in Egyptian art, in Islamic art, in ancient art, Michelangelo, Cezanne. She really was interested in everything. And actually, in her collection of books that eventually was offered to the Art Gallery of Ontario in the 1970s, there was also a book on the anatomy of a cow. So she was quite fascinated in everything and was able to kind of bring it all together in her work. Like Georgia O'Keeffe, she was trained in an academic manner, but going to the Art Students League, very much a place that Georgia O'Keeffe also went to, was a critical turning point. And not very many Canadian artists went to the Art Students League to study, although she was not the only one. And it was a really critical place because it was founded by artists for artists in 1875. And there were many extraordinary things about it. Primarily, every instructor had freedom to teach whatever he or she was interested in, but also live classes were available to women, and that was very rare and very important. And it is at the Art Students League that she comes into contact with the synchromists, who have a profound impact on her painting at the time. And you can see right away that her love of color comes from them. She read The Creative Will, Studies in Philosophy and Syntax of Aesthetics by Stanton McDonald Wright, that was published in 1916, knew his work, and also the work of his fellow American and French synchromists, such as Morgan Russell, Robert Delaunay, Sonia Delaunay, and importantly, Andrew Dasberg, who was her teacher. And these artists spoke of color rhythms, masses, contrast, directions, and continuity, but color above all was central in the painting. Mun, in her notebook, and we have her notebooks at the AGO in the archives, she wrote, "Painting is little more than a transcription of senses, impression, and of accent of vision, light, dark, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, up, down, right, left, straight, round, large, small, and so on. The synchromists also asserted the primary importance of the human body, even though what we're looking at is quite abstract work. They were really interested in particular the way in which Michelangelo dealt with the human figure, and that was something that eventually translates to the way in which Munn develops her own vision. But to return to Munn and to her cows, and she makes quite a number of paintings of cows, and as I mentioned before, she developed this signature use of bold colors and experimental technique to paint as early as 1916. And if we think about 1916 in Canada, this is the year that Tom Thomson paints the West Wind and the Jack Pine. And Emily Carr has already returned from Europe, and she's already stopped painting actually by 1916, having painted the Northwest Coast villages in very Fauves colors. But this painting really stands out in what we tend to think about the kind of painting that took place in 1916. As you can see, her paintings were concerned with the use of color to define form and the idea of releasing paintings from a literal description, although she was not uninterested in that, and you'll see as I go on. As she said, perfect beauty is the expression of perfect order, balance, harmony, rhythm. Beauty is a supreme instance of order, intuitively felt, instinctively appreciated. And I love this painting for many reasons, for aesthetic reasons, of course, but also for some personal ones. It was one of the very first that I worked on when I started my work at the Art Gallery of Ontario. So it's been quite rewarding to be able to spend quite a bit of time looking at it, thinking about it, and being quite mesmerized by the way that she builds this painting out of a mosaic of color. And yet the cows and the tree are clearly discernible. It's clear that even though the painting is about color, the cows are rendered quite naturalistically with quite some joy and humor, because the more you try to look at the painting and try to figure out just how many cows there are in there, and when you come to the AGO next time, you can spend some time counting them. But what you realize also that she's also bringing you face to face with the orange cow's backside. You really are full frontal with the cow's backside. And I think that there's something very human about that. She spent time in Manitoba on her sister's farm, but she was very much a city person. But nonetheless, I think there's a little bit joy and humor in the way that she's thinking about cows. As I mentioned, live classes were available at the Art Students League, and she paints the nude, as every serious painter has to do once in their career, although she paints it several times. And this is very much considered to be one of her most accomplished painting. And we know the title and we know the date because she actually exhibited it in 1923. And I'm just going to show you a photograph of Munn in her studio in the 1930s in Toronto, in a studio, an apartment that she actually built for herself. And you can see the Henri Matisse print of the dance that she has on her wall. Again, the dance being a really critical theme in modern art, in fact, in art in general. And the family still has this work, this print actually, and I was quite surprised to see it about a year and a half ago, that I assumed that it was in color. But in fact, it is in black and white. And you can see that actually her dance is quite different from Matisse's. There are 5 stylized nudes, and each one of them is positioned in a different dynamic pose built out of these triangles of color. When she exhibited it in 1923 at the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts, it really stood out, and the critic described it as unique and futuristic with cubist suggestions. And often Munn's dynamic and colorful paintings were seen as baffling and out of place, even while she was being recognized as one of the ablest women painters and one of the most advanced. Her interest in color had advanced from those early paintings of cows. She has refined her vision into a crystalline expression of bodies in motion, almost kaleidoscopic. And I remember once speaking about MUN at the AGO, and one of the audience member asked me quite a lovely question, because MUN's family business was a jewelry store, and they wondered if there had been some impact that dealing with jewelry might have had on her development of her painting. And I think that the answer is, of course, because artists take their cues from everywhere without having to explain or justify anything. Whether she was aware of it or not is besides the point. What's lovely is that all of these things make up her consciousness, and in her awakening of our artistic vision, she was able to crystallize it into this amazing painting. But I had a chance to spend some more time with this painting recently. It continues to be in a private collection. And what I discovered looking at it is that, just like with the cows, even though overall it appears quite abstract, she is so interested in articulating the details of the face and the feet and the breast. And in fact, all 5 figures and all of their breasts, they all have this nipple included. You know, she is interested in giving you everything. And as attached as she was to color, it was though her coming across Jay Hambich's principles of dynamic symmetry that really shifted and moved MUN into a new direction. Hambidge was a Canadian-born artist and a mathematician. He was a student of classical art who also studied at the Art Students League. He's really best known for these principles of dynamic symmetry, which is a design theory in which mathematical formulas are the foundation of classical architecture and various natural structures. In his introduction to his lessons in 1919, and we can tell that MUN was able to actually hear his lectures in person, he argued for the development of modern art rooted in classical principles. And he wrote, "The basic principles underlying the greatest art so far produced in the world may be found in the proportions of the human figure and in the growing plant. The dynamic is a symmetry suggestive of life and movement, and the symmetry of man is one of the key sources of its study." He advocated for an intelligent artist who learned from nature's ideal rather than simply following it. And he wrote, "Without reason, art becomes chaotic. Instinct and feeling must be directed by knowledge and judgment." And he was adamant that the study of dynamic symmetry would lead to an expression of ourselves, our time, the aspirations of our own age. And MUN shared with Hambidge the strong belief that the mystery of life can be expressed in the search for an all-encompassing truth. She wrote, "No one artist can represent all the beauty of life," but the implication is that she was going to attempt to do just that. And 50 years later, she reiterated that she sought to achieve in her work something inevitable, found in composing, like nature, like the universe, space, rhythm, harmony, creating a mathematical figure. He offered in his publications and in his lectures very explicit mathematical instructions and diagrams demonstrating these principles of dynamic symmetry as he saw them derived from nature and Greek art. And the most important one being this principle of the whirling square, this rectangle that it was also called the whirling square, numerically expressed as 1.618 and commonly referred to as the golden ratio. This is the root rectangle in which the ratio of the longer side to the shorter is a square root of an integer such as the root 5. And the square is derived from a root 5 rectangle by bisecting its diagonal at a right angle from one of its corners. The area of the original rectangle is thus now divided into a square, and another rectangle proportional to the first is created. And the same division can be continued to be derived in a smaller rectangle, again resulting in a square, and so on, producing an iterative system. And the whole form is around this spiraling, whirling into infinity. And here it is, perhaps a much better known diagram of the same idea. And Hambidge actually by 1923 was interested in taking these principles and applying them to the American artists, contemporary artists who were working at the time, because he believed that without these principles, much of the weakness of modern art, as he wrote, is due to too much sex, too much sentiment, and too little design. And this is actually a passage that Munn copied and highlighted in her notebook. And what I want to show you, just how committed she was to these principles. These are from her archives. These are drawings. You can see that she's actually copying his diagrams in her notebooks in all of these pages. And again, close up of all of these rectangles and which one produce what square roots. And also here it is in the margin, it says root 5. And you can see indeed that a drawing such as this one, that is derived from those diagrams that Hambidge made, can be so easily applied to a painting like The Dance. In 2019, we spent about a year looking at a painting in our collection. This painting came in 2012. And the reason we were able to take such time with it is because when it came into the collection, it actually looked like this. It had suffered quite a bit of trauma. There were some minor losses, but also there was this efflorescence that came from beneath. Basically, Epsom salts were coming to the surface, and they were creating this haze, and you could no longer see the beautiful colors that she was using. So, and here you can see the loss and that Epsom salt that was just all over certain parts of the painting, and we were trying to understand what was going on. And because we were able to spend so much time with the painting and do some reflected infrared photography, what we were able to understand is that underneath this painting was a quite elaborate underdrawing that is directly related to the principles of dynamic symmetry. And you can see that the way in which she applies these principles is actually to be able to derive the placement and the proportions of the forms so that the whole is actually one system of unity. And the rectangle that generates the head and the neck of the main figure is the basic unit of design for the rest of the composition. And we also discovered in our archives that, in fact, she made many preparatory drawings. These are the two that we know of, where you can see she is dividing the paper in all of these rectangles and then figuring out the placement of the figure. And this very much helped us understand how we can push the conservation of the painting. As you can see, I hope on your screen you can see the faint pencil lines underneath in the black and white image, and then how we were able to understand how to treat it and to where to bring the painting back to. I'm giving you a sense of what it looked like before and during treatment. And again, you can see that because we were able to spend so much time and understand what are some of the principles and her techniques, we were able to actually know that we can trust Munn to lead us to her original vision. And now it really is a painting that quite sings. And it is really this principle of dynamic symmetry that sets her apart from the group. She exhibits with them in 1927 and 1928. And Bertram Brooker, her friend, includes her in a very important publication. But in her notebooks, there is a note where she says, you know, that the nationalism and national painting is something that's very worn, and really it is about joining the world. And this is where she's interested in going. And she does something quite extraordinary, because after 1930, her deep passion for color is translated into immense love of painting. And in fact, she spends the last decade of her career drawing. I'm just showing you another painting from our archives. This is unfinished work, and you can see how very meticulously she planned everything. So So she spends a decade making these kinds of drawings. And there are thousands of them in the AGO archives, and they can be quite daunting. And I was very lucky early on to spend quite a bit of time with them and really understand that these were all preparatory drawings for what has now come to be her most accomplished series of works. And these are 10 ink drawings from about 1935 to about 1938. They're called the Passion series. And you can see that even though these are quite abstract works in one way, that notion of representation continues to interest her. As you can see, the moon is maybe a metaphor for Christ's passing, but also the way in which all of these, if you look very closely to all of these figures, they all have noses and they all have fingers and they all have quite detailed impression. And she showed these in 1935. Bertram Brooker invited her to be in an exhibition, and in 2011 we brought them all together. And for the very first time, Kathleen Munn had her solo exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. So as I mentioned, in the archives, there are thousands of these, and it really is, you understand that she was actually quite obsessed with the human figure and understanding how to apply the principles of dynamic symmetry, basically to create essentially one human figure rotating in space in every way. And then she devised her very own system of how she was able to do that. She actually had her nephew construct a light box for her, and we still have it in the archives. And she used this very thin typewriter paper, and she would draw on both sides of the paper. This was, for me, the most extraordinary thing. As I was sitting in the archives, I could see that she drew on one side. You can see the figure of the Christ, and then on the back side you can see it's just rotating legs. And I simply held up the piece of paper one day and I looked through the light that came through the window, and I realized that that's what she was doing. She was interested in this movement, this three-dimensional movement of the figure in space. And I mean, it's close to madness, I would say. Almost every one of these drawings has a number associated with it. It's almost impossible to decode, although after a while I realized that that number 709 refers to a figure design that is bent forward, and 809 is a foreshortened figure. And she just was so extraordinary in the way in which she kept thinking through mathematically how to devise the human figure, and then cutting up all of these pieces of paper to create collages, putting them all together to create her composition. And then this is where the madness continues. You can see the Ascension, one of the drawings from the Passion series. And when we turned the framed work around, she had actually sewn her canvas to her stretcher also in these rays. I mean, it was quite exhilarating to see. And I don't know if you can see in the other image, that's a close-up, but when we took the drawing out of its frame, we could see that there were these lines that extended beyond the image that had letters associated with them. So there was a real system that she used, real meticulous, precise approach to creating something that in many ways just seems so fully formed. And this is one of the very last drawings that we know that she made in 1938. And in fact, it is one of only 2 works that were ever purchased in her lifetime. And they were offered for purchase at the Art Gallery of Toronto, as it was called then. And the reason why I know that she never compromised is because Bertram Brooker and all the other members of the acquisitions committee wrote to her saying that they would like to acquire some work by her. And she wrote back saying, I will send you a list of works that I would like to be represented by, and this is how much they cost. And if you are not interested in having them, that is completely fine by me. But these are the works that I want to be known for. And for me, these drawings have always held, again, such fascination because she's such a modern thinker, so very committed to her own vision, her own understanding of connecting to the mystery, the life force of the universe. And the fact that she kind of focuses on the Passion of Christ, a subject matter that, of course, has been part of Western art, obviously, since the beginning of Christianity. But the fact that she was so committed to it, and in some ways, she was not interested so much in the narrative. She was interested in certain moments in the Passion of Christ, and sometimes she repeated them several times. So, for example, the descent and the ascension and the crucifixion, she draws again and again. And what I've come to think about is that the Passion of Christ is in Western art, in thinking, in Christian philosophy, if we can call it that, is the ultimate transfiguration of matter into spirit, object into idea. And I think that for her, the subject matter did matter in the sense that she was seeking something that was transformative, something that was an awakening of a vision. And by focusing on this moment when Christ becomes spirit again, is reunited with the universe, is for her, I think, a place where she had immense sources of inspiration. She was not religious. She was not brought up religious. She was not interested in any of that, but she was interested, I think, in the fundamental idea of how does matter turn to energy, turn to spirit. All those things that she was so very passionate about, she was able to crystallize, I think, in this one of her last drawings that she ever made. By the mid-1940s, she stops making art for a number of reasons. And by the time she dies in 1974, she's almost completely unknown. She has by now been completely written out of Canadian art history. But at the very end, she writes several letters to Charlie Hill, who was then curator at the National Gallery of Art, seeking very much to be taken seriously again. And he was quite taken with the drawings and begins the, again, very slow museum process of trying to bring work into the collection. And it was only in 1990, obviously way after she passed away, that the first work by Munn entered the collection of the National Gallery. And I'm going to end here with this amazing photograph of Munn in the 1940s. By this time, she has already stopped making work, but I love this photograph very much because it shows a very different side of her. To connect this image of her with that image of the Passion of Christ is quite extraordinary. And I think that we owe a great debt of gratitude to Professor Joyce Siemens, who almost by chance rediscovered her in the 1980s, put her in a double exhibition, and since then has inspired so many of her students. And I count myself very lucky to be one of those students, to be able to continue her work and really make the case, which I think is quite absolute, that we can no longer speak about the development of modern art in Canada without thinking about Kathleen Munn. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Georgiana. That was incredibly eye-opening. Okay, I'm going to stop with the screen share. Just hang on a few seconds.
I think I have to do that, I think.
Okay, and we're back. Okay, yeah, that's so incredible. And even coming from a fine arts background myself, this is the first time hearing of Kathleen Munn. So I really enjoyed learning more about her, and she's definitely someone that I want to research further. Just fascinating work that she made. So we have some great questions rolling in here, a lot of thank yous and a lot of congrats. Everybody really enjoyed the talk. A few people here are asking about why she stopped making her art so long before the end of her life.
And this is the perennial question.
Yeah.
There's quite a number of reasons. It's hard to know which one was in particular, because as I think I mentioned, she was not interested in the group project, but she was very much affected by it. And people remember her being quite frustrated by the fact that that kind of Canadian painting really kind of took over and there was very little space. So she was quite discouraged that even though she exhibited, there was very little room for the kind of art that she was interested in to really find kind of kindred spirits. So there was that. There were also a number of family issues having to do with the fact that she continued to live with her brother and her sister. And certain deaths in the family meant that she had to actually take over the family business. She had been the baby of the family. All she had ever done was make art. And all of a sudden, she had to take care of the family business. And she had to devote herself to that. There's also some thinking that her eyesight also began to be affected, and she didn't really want to speak much about that. And so it was another reason why she stopped making work. But in her archives, and also continually in the family archives, there are letters in which she continues to speak of herself as an artist, of her studio, of her work, and she continues to very much pay attention to what's going on in the art world. I know it's quite extraordinary to devote your first, over 50 years to art, and then really give up and live in a very small apartment in North Toronto, Bathurst and Eglinton, just surrounded by all the work you made for decades prior.
Yeah, crazy. It's just an incredible story. I have another question here from Tina, and she is asking, do we know anything about the kind of paper she used for her sketches?
Oh yes, the ones that are in the archives. I hope that's the ones you mean. So, because she kept everything, and then her niece was so in a way burdened, but in a way very responsibly taking care of everything. She really kept everything. So they were these typewriter paper pads. And we know that they are that because she still has in the archives the actual pad out of which she ripped all the pieces of paper. But for her drawings, she used handmade paper. She used high quality, for the ink drawings that she eventually makes, she uses very high quality paper. But yeah, initially, I guess she needed, because she really literally made thousands. She needed a lot of typewriter paper. It was see-through and thin and readily available.
Well, I mean, you use what you got, hey? Another question here from Beverly. She's asking, did she ever teach art or take on apprentices, to your knowledge?
No, I don't think she never had to do anything beyond art in order to earn her living. She was very fortunate that way. And I think that because of that, she was able to pursue it really to her exclusive interest. Another reason why she never had to compromise. Although I know that she was part of artist groups where people would get together and draw together with Brooker, but no.
I mean, very fortunate for her to have the opportunity to devote so much time to herself and her art making. Another question here from Claire. She is asking, did Munn ever connect to the vortices? I can't say that I'm familiar.
Yeah, and I haven't explored that very far, but my instinct would be to say that she was probably very much aware of their work. And as I mentioned, she really was a voracious reader and went to exhibitions and lectures, in particular in New York. And also because she was part of the Art Students League, she would have come into contact with a lot of artists who would have brought these ideas to her. But I think that is a real place of research to understand what her connection to that may be.
Mhm.
And another one that hasn't yet to be explored, but I had a former student who did a lot of work for her MA on this, and is the connection to modern dance and movement and theories of modern art dance theories. If I said that correctly, because I think there is something there as well.
Awesome. Sandra here is asking, she says, I'm just wondering if David Milne was related to Eleanor Milne. She did the artwork, or at least a lot of it, at Parliament Hill.
Oh,
Yeah.
I do not know.
Not familiar? Oh,
He was another very singular, he literally went into the woods, built his own cabin by hand, like he really needed to be away from people to draw and make watercolors. Yeah.
Oh, and Nancy is asking if you could explain who the Vortices were, what they do. Or what, I guess, what it is in general.
So yeah, no, it's a theory of modern art from around the same period, primarily very popular in the United Kingdom. So there are a number of artists who followed these principles because it was ways to get to abstraction, So there was such debate about what it meant to really leave representation to start to create non-objective painting. So people went at it in very many different ways.
Okay, wonderful. And Lori, she's asking if there are any books planned about Munn maybe in the future.
Yes, actually, there already is a book online that I wrote in 2014, I think, part of the Art Canada Institute. So you just have to, as I like to go, DuckDuckGo it. You just go to an internet search machine and put in Kathleen Munn, the Art Canada Institute. And there's an online publication on her art and life, and many of many of the paintings that I showed today are there as well. There is also, there actually are quite a number of publications. And there's one upcoming essay that I wrote about Munn that's coming up in an exhibition organized by the McMichael called Uninvited. And Munn will be exhibited there. And actually it'll be the very first time that painting that I showed you, the one that we conserved, will be exhibited for the very first time. And I think that exhibition is planned to be open at the McMichael this June, if all goes well and we start to get vaccinated.
Yeah, oh, fascinating. I was flipping through the online book today, actually, and it's just fascinating, very in-depth. I think this will be my last question from our very own Natalie, and she's asking, how does the AGO sort through all of her works of art and drawings to determine which works to add to the AGO's collection?
So, like with many women artists, it is always quite an adventure to find all the work. And we have been quite fortunate to be able to get to know the family and to have a sense of the work that continues to be in private collections. And again, like with many women artists who are collected, sometimes there is a very strong attachment that people feel to the work. And it takes quite a bit of convincing to be able to to part with them and be able to add them to the collection. But we have been very fortunate just in the last couple of years. We received a collection of muns from one collector and really be able to really grow our collection. Was that Natalie's question?
Yeah, I believe
Okay.
so. Yep. I know sorting through tons and tons of drawings was probably no easy task. Natalie says thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
it looks like we've come to a good closing point. I think we've answered everybody's questions and we're right on schedule. So look at that, we did wonderfully. So before I let you all go, thank you so much for tuning into this lecture series. It means so much to us here at the gallery. To all of our audience members, thank you for making this a huge success. And I'd like to thank our sponsors for this exhibition, the Rogers Family Charitable Trust and Pusher Mitchell for all of their support in Northern Pine. And I would like to also mention that our next lecture series will kick off on March 25th in conjunction with our next exhibition, which will be Bombhead. So join us then with the exhibition curator, John O'Brien. I hope to see you all there, and thank you so much. Thank you, Georgiana. It was a pleasure. I hope we'll see you in Kelowna someday soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.